founded in the 20th century. Of course, AMAUTA, but of course here is present a good friend of mine, Roger Malina. His father founded Leonardo Magazine, which I'm also proud of being part of that network, because we don't consider that just a journal, but also a network, a platform. And also there are also amazing publications. I'm also a great admirer of publications like Third Text, which was one of the first publications that really discuss about post-colonial issues on art and culture globally. So once more, these are not only, we should not see these written publications only as publications, but as a network of connections and platforms. I'm just gonna briefly explain a little bit about Mariategui for you that might not know him, though I'm not gonna focus that much on his writings, but I'm gonna focus briefly on his cultural endeavors. So Mariategui he's considered one of the most influential intellectuals of the 20th century in Latin America, whose significance accrues and evolves over the time. Within his very brief lifespan of nearly 20 years, he passed away when he was 35, extremely young, in 1930. He successfully defined his distinctive character as a thinker and a producer of an original and fundamental corpus of work that reflect on Peruvian reality, but from a global perspective. This is why perhaps a right way to define Mariategui was he was a panorama man in a way. So he experienced a childhood full of hardships. Due to a chronic illness, he was deprived of formal education, both at school and at university. So he never went to university, and he partly did school. But however, he had an early stimulated environment which made him an autodidact, and he transformed his lack of studies into an advantage. He developed a self-teaching capacity, which made him a voracious reader of everything that he had at hand, contributing to promptly maturing and what he would later define as an ephemeral childhood, which went towards a premature adolescence. He started working at a newspaper in Lima, at La Prensa, but he didn't started working as a journalist. He started in humble practices, starting first as a messenger, then transiting to become the linotypist assistant, and then as a proofreader, making his way to the newsroom, which is interesting because in a way one of his functions was also to pick up the articles that the journalists were delivering to the printing area, to the print area. So that enabled him to also understand all the different processes, the technical processes regarding printing publications, printing news, printing newspapers, printing and later printing books and journals. So I think that's a very important aspect. The other important aspect is that while he was working in these very humble jobs, he also was in charge of picking some of the cables for the journalists, which, you have to see the cables of the 1910s or 20s as the internet today, in a way. So that also enabled him to understand what was going on in the world. Imagine at that time, it was fantastic. So that also, when he was very young, while he was at the hospital, it was a French hospital in Lima, and he self-taught French because it was most of the people that were on that hospital were French. So he learned French, which at that time in the 10s and the 20s was what it is English today, a lingua franca, the universal language for culture. So he very quickly went to become one of the most prominent journalists when he was very, very young. And then with this comprehensive journalistic practice, it also allowed him to have a very good understanding of all the working practices on editorial and journalistic enterprises. So he started very soon to develop his own endeavors, his own personal or professional project. So he started first with a journal called Nuestra Época, Our Age, in 1918, and then a newspaper, a daily called La Razón, The Reason, in 1919. Being an uncomfortable figure to the president of Peru, Augusto B. Leguía, in 1919, he was obliged to travel to Europe as a propaganda agent to the Peruvian government in Italy. A very subtle way of deportation. And since then, I mean, he then lived first in Italy and then in Germany. Many of the things that you will see at the beginning of the exhibition are based on the experience that Mariategui also developed while he was in the exhibition at the Blanton Museum. Are these experiences that Mariategui got while he was in Italy and Germany, where he was really immersed in the systematic study, not just of Marxism, but also understanding the dynamics of fruitful editorial and intellectual enterprises like Gramsci's L'Ordine Nuovo, or Gobetti's La Rivoluzione Liberale, or Barbieu's Clart and Clarité. So I mean, in this time, don't forget that Europe also helped him to develop a very special and characteristic literary style to communicate his ideas, to become less rhetoric than what when he was in Lima, and during this period he developed his own distinctive and elegant prose and style. So Mariategui returned to Peru. He returned in 1923 with the idea of founding a newspaper. It was very interesting because he decided first to call the owner of the newspaper that he was working in Lima at that time, El Tiempo, and he offered to buy the newspaper. He mentioned in one letter, which, I mean, all these letters are, by the way, online on the archive. He mentioned that he had the investors to buy the newspaper. That did not materialize, but a few months later, in October of 1923, he assumed the interim direction of Claridad. Claridad was a journal connected to the university movements. And that was very important also because in a way it was the first stage in which he was really involved with the development of a more organic journal in Lima. And at the same time, he did something that was very important. He started a press. And for that, he realized that one of the most important things was to buy a printing machine. So he bought from Italy a printing machine, and he founded a press called Minerva Press in Lima. Minerva Press established what we could say was a technological turn without any other previous milestones in the history of Peruvian publishing. It was the first press that was dedicated to print books on literature and social sciences. And once more, he had what I call autonomy, not just intellectual, but autonomy in terms of production, because he was able to have a printing press that was his property. If you once more, if we think today, it's like having, a website or something that you are able to use yourself, and that you really don't need anybody that or you don't depend on anyone to publish. So once more, we have to think also when we talk about these instances, we have to think a little bit of how can we compare those instances to today's reality. And as in his condition of not just of editor but also artistic director of that press, he developed a very ambitious publication plan and became very active. More than 50 books were published, and we were talking with Jose, certain books by people like Eguren or you may see this very interesting book here called 5 Meters of Poetry, that was not also published in Minerva, but it was not only an interesting graphic exercise. It has 10 different types of fonts, but it's also a technical accomplishment. So once more, it's interesting to understand the knowledge that Mariategui had, not only through his amazing intellectual capacities, but also understanding his technical knowledge, which was definitely developed while he was working as a youngster in Lima in the printing press. So this facet of Mariategui as a cultural entrepreneur is relatively unexplored, and this is something that we've been trying to do at the archive, not just by analyzing the letters that Mariategui wrote with so many well-known people from that time, but also other content, even administrative letters that usually are not that valuable, but that really makes us understand the huge complexity and the big scope of the network that Mariategui developed. Anna is going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So this facet as a cultural entrepreneur is relatively unexplored, and these activities are summed up not just by his editorial experience through his publications and journals, but also most prominently by the work he did at AMAUTA. And AMAUTA means in Quechua, in an indigenous language from Peru, wise teacher. And what he did with AMAUTA was really interesting. He developed a real platform where he configured the journal, this avant-garde journal, as an intellectual and social force. Mariategui didn't believe really on disciplines in silo. He already thought a lot about multidisciplinarity at that time, and he proposed a very transversal knowledge without any academic judgment. So in AMAUTA you would find in the first issues articles by Einstein, by Sigmund Freud, but also discussions about indigenism or broader discussions about literature in Latin America, for example. So the scope of interest was very diverse, and this also enabled to develop and extend, in a way, a sort of capillary tissue of collaborators and distributors that allow him to understand the true national reality directly from its actors, the intellectuals, the educators, the workers, among others. So while he developed the journal, he didn't only envision the publication, but also the diffusion of that publication. It's interesting to mention that we spotted that at least 3,000 or 4,000 copies of each journal was published, and those we spotted through the analysis of the data that they went to the most tiny cities and towns in Peru, and the same people that were the agents, the sales agents, were also people. The people that were distributing the journal were also people that were informing Mariategui about what was going on in those places. So that enabled him to really develop a very strong network. Another issue that it's interesting is how from AMAUTA he also developed other endeavors. Perhaps one of the most interesting ones was the bi-weekly called Labor, and it was kind of the connection between AMAUTA and the workers, and the community of workers, the labor unions that were at that time been nurturing. And that enabled Mariategui also that biweekly labor enabled him to found the Socialist Party in Peru in 1928, as well as the union workers, the Peruvian union workers in 1929. So all these projects were very important by themselves, but once more, we have to spot them as part of different social and political initiatives that connect one with the other. And the interesting thing, perhaps one of the innovative things about how Mariategui worked, is that he connected